Fellow children, would you pray with me? Loving God, you are in all things. We ask now that you would take our words and speak with them, our minds and think with them, our hands and work with them, and our hearts and set them on fire with love for you and all of creation. Amen. Vaccinium corymbosum. Anyone? I would be utterly amazed. Blueberries. Vaccinium corymbosum. I had the deep privilege afforded to me as one of your pastors in this congregation to have vacation. And I just got back from that vacation. 3 weeks of vacation. In that time, I experienced some of these wild gifts of God, these blueberries. And before seeing them in northern Maine, where I went with my spouse and 3-year-old, Rowan, asked me, where do blueberries come from? And I said, well, they're not from trees, but they're from bushes. And he sort of looked perplexed. And within an hour, we stopped on the side of the road at a vista, and there were some wild blueberries on the side of the road, which we got to pick, and he got to see where these wild blueberries were. An incredible moment of God's grace and wilderness in the midst of the everyday moments. So I had planned to talk about blueberries today, because I was excited about my vacation. I wanted to come back and bring that to you and explain to you all of the theological imperatives that lie behind Vaccinium corymbosum. And the world crashed in on us a week ago. Charlottesville happened, and many of us were surprised by the hatred and the white supremacy and the white nationalism that lies right under the surface of the systemic evils of our society. Others of us were not surprised. More accurately, those of us, people of color, most likely many of whom were not as surprised as those of us who self-identify as white. These problems have been existing, but Charlottesville brought things that are real in an embodied and incredibly frightful way to our senses and our ears and our eyes. And as a church, we gathered a week ago, and we took some of that in. We heard about the storm and the call of Jesus to get out into that storm because God is present in the midst of it. And so I want to take that idea of blueberries and the grace of God and link those things as we look at a world that knows Charlottesville as way too many of them, and think about the grace that exists in our world. And so I say thank you to God for what took place in Boston yesterday in response to such evil and incredibly overwhelming, peaceful rally, counter-protest, which the world paid attention to. Thanks be to God, and well done, Boston. Thank you, the interfaith community that showed up in such a powerful way. Thank you to everyone who made difficult decisions. There was no right or wrong decision yesterday as to where to be. It was a tension-filled week that led up to Saturday morning. And I confess a whole range of fears and emotions that led up to where to be yesterday took place and transpired. But in that, a beautiful coming together of community in a radical way in such a short time. And again, I thank GBIO, I thank the moral movement here in Boston, I thank Church of the Covenant and our partners in faith. It was good to see the church on the street. And so, friends, in the light of these things, it's important for us to remember that a march happened. And it brought peace, and it spoke to a world about peace, but it did not eradicate, of course, white supremacy in our world. Hatred has not been eclipsed. Totality has not yet happened. And so we come to church and we look for a sense of where God is in the midst of these things. We hear music, we sing from our hearts, we look to our scriptures, and we yearn for a word. So thanks, God, for Psalm 133. how good and pleasant it is when kindred live together in unity. It's like oil running down over the beard onto the collar of robes. We tasted a little bit of that oil yesterday, which gives us hope for a movement, for the courage to stand up in the face of fear with radical nonviolence. And so we then turn to our gospel. And we ask Jesus, did you read Psalm 133? Do you remember that? It doesn't seem like it in this text. A woman comes to you, Jesus, and says, I need something from you. I need healing for my daughter. And Jesus says, no, you're not who I am here to heal. You are from another side. You are other than me. I am called to serve those in my tribe and not yours. This was a Canaanite woman, of course, someone who a rabbi of Jesus' social standing would most likely not talk to, very different than him at the time, a very large void between culture here. And yet she engages Jesus, and Jesus responds in a way in which he seems to contradict the very things he had just said. It is what comes out of your mouth that defiles. And does he not insult in an incredibly racially charged, perhaps racist way, this dear child of God in this time? Did Jesus not understand that Canaanite lives matter? Not just Jewish lives in this time. This text should trouble us. And yet, the text does not end with this insult, with this degradation, with this dehumanization coming from Jesus. This is a story, ultimately, of what it means that we follow a God who is not only fully human, but fully divine. The full humanity of Jesus here is located in a time and a place, a social structure, an understanding of the way the world is, a religious identity that is beautiful yet limited. And we see that come to fore here in this insult. Of course, some people think that Jesus was joking or being sarcastic with the woman, but that doesn't seem to line up with the way the story goes. It doesn't seem to line up with how Jesus is in the rest of our gospel narratives. But what happens here is that Jesus' ethno-religious identity is broken open, and he receives and is reminded of the broader vision that God calls him and all of us to. An imagination of what God calls us to, that God is not just for one tribe, but for all nations. This woman persists, and she calls Jesus to account, and Jesus understands that she is filled with faith. Your faith has healed you and your daughter. Go now. We can imagine Jesus was exhausted before this. The text before tells of all his healings and his travels with his disciples across the landscape. Perhaps he was at his lowest moment. Perhaps he was not remembering his relationship with God. Perhaps he was not centered. Friends, the call in this text that I see is a call to remember our humanity and to remember the calling and the reminder to center ourselves in our identity in God. In spite of the distractions, in spite of all the exhaustion that living in this world leads to all too often. For in so doing, we remember that we are created by God and all others are so too created. God loves all lives, and until all lives of people matter, no life actually does. Therefore, we today have to raise high the banner of Black Lives Matter, because in our landscape, in our nation, they do not yet. Our voice is important in this work, a church that is primarily and historically more white than of color, and so we have an opportunity before us. We have the privilege of being in this march. I heard from many people of color yesterday that they had no choice but to show up. And the violence and the fear that some of us who are not people of color felt on that day yesterday, there was some charged fear before the rally began, is something that some of them experience on a daily basis. So they are counting in some ways on us, and obviously we are counting on things like yesterday happening so that our faith is enlivened and the reality of our world is brought to the reality of God's desire for the world. I have dear friends in Charlottesville who were among the 50 who lined up and linked their arms, aware that they could die. One is a mother of a 7-year-old, he's my godson, and she stood there understanding that this could be her last moment, and yet she stood because she was linked to 49 other arms. The power of community came out in an incredible way as people were willing then to put their bodies on the line, an embodiment of their faith. And that's what we were challenged to do as a community, as a city yesterday. We were led by people of color. The march yesterday was not organized by the interfaith community. We took our lead from Black Lives Matter Boston and Black Lives Matter Cambridge, and that was not usurped in any way. And we as clergy were asked to actually join in the entire march, not to march separately as sometimes in rallies we've been asked to do, but to intersperse ourselves and to be part of the de-escalation and the elevation, so that the narrative could be won for the day, that peace is more powerful, that love is more powerful, and that is what we are called to do. One of the many signs I saw yesterday was Jesus is a brown refugee. We remember these things, our icons tell us these things, but the world often forgets these things. Another sign of a dear quote from Dr. Martin Luther King from the Birmingham jail: "The great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than justice." Friends, we know these things here at this church, and I am incredibly proud of this congregation for doing the hard work this past year of looking at race and identity. It's so much easier to think about all the other needs in our world, many of which seem and are very pressing and very real. There is fear in Burkina Faso right now from attacks. There is fear in Barcelona from attacks. There is climate change happening. There is LGBT discrimination in our city. There are so many things that call our attention, that call our morality and our faith to count. And sometimes we forget that race and racial injustice is not a priority, and we must make it so. So I'm grateful that this church has done that. And today we have some more resources before us. This past week, it's been incredible to see people not remain silent. We know that silence is an answer, and so we have not heard much silence, thanks be to God, from the interfaith community. We have a letter from the Mass Council of Churches at GBIO that wrote this incredible letter together, which lands, it's here at the back of the church, that's why I'm pointing back there. It ends, we heard this at the gathering on Friday night at Temple Israel, it ends with these questions that locate this back to ourselves, knowing that yesterday was not just a moment, but part of a wider movement and a call to be engaged in this work throughout our daily life. What is one concrete action you can take today to oppose the despicable actions in Charlottesville and elsewhere in your country? What can you help address? How can you help address issues of racism and bigotry in your own country? Where might you engage in meaningful conversation and action with people of different religious and cultural identity? And what sustains you in your peace and justice efforts? We might add to that, what do you imagine God's dream is for this world? That dream is not an individual dream, it is a corporate dream, and we need to dream that together to embody the beloved community, friends. And I'm grateful that we are about that work. We will continue that work. There is a small group called the Race and Identity Team, and we are always welcoming more members in this church, so if you want to be part of that, please raise your hand at some point in this community and join in, because all voices are important in this work. Jesus changed in this text. Some people find that hard to comprehend, but Jesus, it sure seems in our text, changed thanks to the love, the incredible love of the unnamed Canaanite woman who shows up. From being named something, being called a dog, this woman then renames herself as a child of God, and Jesus sees that, and therefore both are set free and healing begins. Friends, may we see our true names, may we understand one another's true names in this world, and may we dream creatively about what might be possible. I loved one of the many things that took place in advance of yesterday's rally. Friday, it was just on Friday, Mariama White Hammond and some others saw this idea that was put forward in Germany during, recently, over time, when there are Nazi rallies in Germany. People put together fundraisers to dedicate pledges for every Nazi who shows up. People will donate money. And you saw that, you may have seen that through Boston, Make Haters Pay, hashtag Make Haters Pay. This effort in Boston was named at just collecting money in advance of yesterday's rally. And as of early this morning, some $78,000 have been raised. The goal was about $100,000, and it may be more than that. GBIO celebrated that on Friday night. And this idea that we have creative ways to respond, not just to be against, but to be for something. The money was going to all sorts of organizations, including Black Lives Matter, the Council on American-Islamic Relations, Southern Poverty Law Center, Showing Up for Racial Justice, the North American Indian Center of Boston, and so on. And we give thanks to that money and the donations and the generosity that came out of that time. And so I want to return to the idea of the gift of blueberries in our world. Friends, it's important to take Sabbath. It is important to go away on vacation. Not all of us have that privilege, I'm well aware. Hudson, who is part of our staff here through a separate private company who does cleaning, does not take vacation. He cleans, and therefore we have spaces both to worship in and to gather here in the women's lunch place. Hudson does not take vacation. He's not afforded that in his life, and that's not correct. He is a person of color in our world. So I am recognizing that vacation is a privilege, not afforded to all. But for those of us who do have such privilege, take it and use it so that you can be restored to give back in this world. And I'm so grateful for time to go camping with a 3-year-old who wondered at the beauty of creation and asked where blueberries come from. He also spoke to his newly awarded lobster that he called Lobby. It's a stuffed lobby. And he said, Lobby, tonight we're going to camp. And camping means we stay in a tent, which is really a house outside. He understood. At first he was thinking we might be moving there for good. But he was assured when we finally got back in our car and drove back home that that was not the case. Rowan understood the beauty of being in God's creation. And therefore we look to something happening tomorrow, 2 minutes and 40 seconds worth of something called Totality, taking place in our country, across 14 states, total eclipse of the sun. It's going to be in your head now the rest of the day. Apparently, the author of that song, or the first singer, what was her name? Someone, Total Eclipse of the Heart. She's going to be singing it on a cruise, looking at the totality. So it's happening. It'll happen. All you need, turn around, bright eyes. That's not the point. The point, I digress, is that a total solar eclipse is taking part tomorrow. And I just wonder if that is God's provision for us to look up and see something new, to see black elevated in our world. Is this not perhaps God's revelation to the nations that black lives matter? Is it not perhaps a sign that we are to look beyond the things that we look for to see God, but look elsewhere to see God in the midst of what the world considers to be nighttime or dark, to sense that God is present, revealing to us the wonder of creation, revealing to us our shared ministry of reconciliation as God's people. May we look with glasses on, but may we look with awe and with wonder to the wonders of God, our Creator, who loves and calls each of us by name.